All right. So for your next lesson this week in biology, we're going to go over taxonomy. It's the organization of life by a guy named Linnaeus. Little weird bit of history with Linnaeus. His adopted father is the gentleman who, several centuries ago, identified black-eyed Susans. So turns out he comes from gardeners too. When we're talking about classification, we break it down into groups. And we don't really teach classification too much anymore in biology, but if you see in the news right now, people don't understand there's a difference between bacteria and viruses, which is one reason why we're going to go back over classification a little bit. Kingdom is the most general. When I was your age, there were only 3 kingdoms. Now there's a bunch. I would never ask you how many kingdoms because we're always rearranging things based on new science discoveries. So kingdom is the most general. Kingdoms would be things like plants, animals, protists, bacteria, and viruses, which may or may not be alive. Species becomes most specific. Here are the major kingdoms of life that I'm going to talk about. Some people argue there's significantly more. You're in high school, you've had a rough year, and hopefully you're getting outside in this nice weather. So kingdoms of life include, and we're going to go through these in a little bit of detail. Viruses we already talked about. They're not alive. They can't reproduce without a host cell. They're not made of cells. So the fancy term for that is acellular. And these are strands of DNA or RNA that infect other cells, turning those cells into factories. We already talked a little bit about this. Common examples are everything you're seeing in the news. Antibiotics don't treat these. These your body either has to fight off and it generates antibodies to make you immune to future infections, or you need a vaccine. There are now antivirals available for some of these. Those did not exist when I was your age. Bacteria are single-celled. They reproduce with fission, and they can be killed with antibiotics. We have 2 groups, archaebacteria and eubacteria. Archaea means old, eu means modern. Awkwardly, modern genetic analysis is suggesting that what we've classified as the old bacteria might in fact be the new bacteria. So I will never test you on that. Protists are usually single-celled. These include amoebas, parameciums, dinoflagellates, diatoms. They're all really cool things. So if you had access to a microscope, or you can actually look at pond water and see quite a few of these things swimming around. When I was your age, protists were classified as single-celled organisms that could only be seen with a microscope. By the time I got to college, they reclassified kelp, which can be 200 feet tall. It's an oceanic protist. When I was your age, it was a plant. By the time I got to college, they made it a protist because all of the kelp cells are the same. They don't make different types of tissue. So now what we say is protists are things where all the cells look the same. And it also means that kelp is now a protist. A lot of your textbooks still haven't caught up with that change, even though it happened in the 90s. So kelp is a protist. And some of them are amazing. The one on the left is sargassum, not sarcasm, sargassum. It's in the Sargasso Sea in the Bermuda Triangle. When I was in college, I got to work on a research boat, and we would pull up nets of this stuff just to analyze it. And this little protist, which is, these things, to give you an idea of scale, this picture would be about 2 feet across. Inside there, you will see little tiny pufferfish that look like sargassum. You'll see little crabs. It's a whole floating ecosystem. Here is another type of protist, kelp, and this is found in the kelp forest off the coast of Monterey Bay in California. It's some amazing diving where you have otters playing around you as you dive. Plants, we already went through plants, and you did such a good job. So these include mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, monocots, dicots. Moss, we already talked about. Ferns, they need moisture, weird reproduction through spores. They go through those weird stages, but we talked about that. We covered that. This is going to be a much monocots. Final review for monocots, because you've seen a lot in my garden. They have only one cotyledon. Flowers have 1, 3, or 6 petals, and the veins are parallel. So this one, you can tell, is a lily, and we have all those things. But we're going to skip ahead. We've covered dicots as well. You're going to be seeing garden videos later this week, beginning of next week, now that my internet's back. So if you look at the maple trees right now, they are flowering because they are dicots. So fungi is where we're going to move on to next. When I was in middle school, fungi were classified as plants because they had cell walls and they grew. Um, what we now know is the cell walls of plants are made of cellulose. So fungi have cell walls, but they're made of chitin. Uh, they so they reproduce with spores, and they are amazing. So we have a few groups. Basidiomycota means club fungus. So there are things that have a traditional mushroom shape, and those include things like this one right here, which grows in my homeland. It's a chanterelle. It's delicious. This one here is called chicken of the woods, equally delicious. This one right here is an ascomycota. Asco refers to those little holes that are actually called an ascus. So these are morels, truffles, and yeast. Next week, I'm going to, for class, give you a mini lab showing you how to make bread using yeast. I'm not going to show you how to make alcohol using yeast because that would be bad. This mushroom right here is called the angel's death cap. It's the deadliest mushroom in the world. One bite will kill you 2 weeks later, and there's no antidote. This is now growing in Denver, and people are freaking out, even though it grows throughout the rest of the United States in the northern areas, where there's this really cool trick where you just don't eat it. Slime molds are these microscopic little things that we don't see too much here because we're too dry. The weird thing about all these mushrooms you're looking at, though, is all these Basidiomycota, you're only looking at the reproductive stuff, the unspeakables of the mushroom. Most of the mushroom's volume is microscopic hairs that go through the soil called hyphae and mycelium, and they help plants grow and decompose. But here are slime molds. Excuse me, I'm going to have an allergy cough. I don't want you to freak out. These have cytoplasmic streaming. Some years I tried to grow this in class just so you can see it. It was the inspiration for the monster in the movie The Blob, which is a really lame horror movie. But if you look at them, you can see cytoplasm going through these weird little tubes if you just using a magnifying glass. Now we're going to get into the cool stuff, animalia. The key for what makes something an animal is it's multicellular, it's heterotrophic, and it has no cell walls. And we're going to go through all of these. So you ready? And these are the major phyla. Porifera are sponges. If you notice, the first thing about sponges is they have no specialized tissue. They're considered the simplest of animal, and at some point, science might move these into protists as well. They have no through gut. They have absolutely no symmetry. Through gut means food goes in one end and comes out the other end. No through gut means you eat and poop out of the same hole. There is no symmetry in the cells. Their structure is supported by these weird little glass shards called spicules they generate. But sponges are amazing. They have lots of cool shapes, and no, that is not Photoshop. There are some massive ones. In history, fishermen used to be convinced that sponges were destroying the oyster beds, so they would chop up sponges and then throw them back in the ocean. Each little piece would end up becoming a brand new sponge. Fortunately, the sponges didn't hurt anything. So porifera are sponges, which are in fact an animal. Cnidaria are stinging-celled organisms. These I'll probably ask you about in your next quiz. They have radial symmetry, no through gut, and they have stinging cells. Radial symmetry means if you look at them, they have a circular pattern, and it's kind of like a pizza or a pie, where it has symmetry in all directions. The stinging cells in them are called nematocysts. And this includes everything from jellyfish to coral to anemones. And I know half of you are now mouthing anemone like you're Finding Nemo. Anemone. But the awesome thing about these things is they all have stinging cells. This jelly right here is called a moon jelly. It's non-stinging. Even though it is actually stinging you, you just can't feel it because your body doesn't react to the venom. Other ones are highly problematic, like box jellies can be highly reactive to humans and cause paralysis. So the other thing to know is cnidarians have two life stages. The jellyfish shape is called the medusa shape. A lot of the terms from cnidaria come from Greek mythology. Medusa, of course, is the god whose face would turn you to stone because there happen to be some jellyfish that do cause paralysis. The coral shape or the anemone shape is like an upside down jellyfish if you think about it. And there was one right there and there was one. Those are a polyp stage. We'll go back. Weird thing is jellyfish start off as a polyp. When they become adults, they become jellyfish or Medusa stage. Coral and anemones are the opposite. When their eggs hatch, um, they start off as a free-swimming, microscopic little jellyfish in a Medusa stage, but when they reach maturity, they flip upside down and become a polyp. Now we're going to start getting into things with through guts, meaning food goes in one end and comes out the other end. One of the first ones we're going to talk about are flatworms. They get the name because they're flat. You'll also notice they have bilateral symmetry. Bilateral means there's one single line, like this blue line of symmetry. And so platyhelminthes are amazing. This one right here is a tapeworm, which used to be a huge problem in the world with human diets. These days, modern food handling makes food a lot safer, reducing our risk of tapeworm. These are sea slugs found in the ocean, and they are not sea slugs. Sorry, these are flatworms. These are so cool. Now, nematoda are roundworms, and they have some other cool features. They have bilateral symmetry. They're smooth. They have a through gut, and these include some weird ones. Let's start with trichinella. Trichinella used to be found in undercooked pork. Until about 10 years ago, you had to cook pork to about 175 degrees in order to make sure there was no trichinella, which were these worms that could invade your muscle tissue if you ate undercooked pork. We now irradiate pork, so that doesn't have to happen. As a result, we don't have to cook pork as hot. Until about the 80s, everybody served pork with applesauce because you had to cook it to the point where it was so dry. Now, the diagram on the right is a health awareness poster from a school nurse's office in the 80s, and it's why kids are gross. Pinworms are ones that end up infecting the lower end of your digestive tract. Usually get exposed to them by, touching a contaminated table, not washing your hands and then eating, things like that. The weird thing is when they reach adulthood, they migrate out the back door of the rectum, and they're microscopic, or not really microscopic, but they're very tiny and they're itchy. There was a case a few decades ago where an entire fourth grade class at a school with an undisclosed location was starting to medicate all the kids for being fidgety with ADHD. When the CDC came in and started looking at this to see if there was like some new contagious form of ADHD, they found out all the kids had pinworm and they were fidgeting in their seats and they had been medicated rather than anyone checking to see if they had pinworm. But this is why you should wash your hands. Annelids are a little bit more evolutionarily complex. They're segmented worms like this earthworm or even leeches. Mollusks are when we start getting amazing. They have bilateral symmetry, they have a through gut, they have a highly developed nervous system and eyes. There's two types. Univalve means one shell, bivalve means two shells. And mollusks are generally considered to be highly intelligent, especially when we get into things like squid and octopus. This cool one right here is a sea slug, also called a nudibranch. And check out the glowy bits of this octopus. That is a baby giant squid that someone found. So univalves are one-shelled, and this includes things like gastropods. And gastro means stomach, poda means foot. These are things that have a stomach foot, like basically they're crawling on their belly. Snails, whelks, conchs, slugs, even terrestrial slugs, and nudibranchs, sea slugs. Another cool one are cephalopods. Cephalopod means head foot, and those are octopus, squid, and nautilus. And this is a deep sea one called the vampire squid of hell, I think. Architeuthis is its Latin genus. This won't attack you because this is found in the deep ocean and several miles deep. And if you encounter this, you have other problems. This is a nautilus, which is such a cool little free swimming thing. Arthropods. Next week, I'm going to try to see if I can show you some of the invertebrates and arthropods that we can find in the Poudre River. Arthro means jointed, poda means appendage. These things have jointed appendages. These were the first animals to walk on land because everything else was mushy and just couldn't really live in air. They have a hardened exoskeleton made up of chitin, the same stuff as mushrooms. This includes insects, crabs, shrimp, spiders. These have bilateral symmetry. And there are some really cool ones. These are blue crabs. They hurt, but they're delicious. Here are scorpions. Scorpions are closely related to spiders, of all things. This is a horseshoe crab, which is actually not a crab. It is in fact a it's more closely related to spiders as well. This is the biggest butterfly in the world, found in Central America, primarily Costa Rica, and this is the blue morpho butterfly. Um, this one here has the best vision in the animal kingdom. It's a mantis shrimp, and these are problematic because, well, they're really cool and they serve a great role in the ecosystem. But if you pick one up, they have such fast movement and such a serrated shell, they will cut your finger to the point where you need stitches. And here are my favorite pollinators, bees. Echinoderms are spiny skilled animals. This is the only group not found in freshwater, and this includes things like sand dollars, sea urchins. These have radial symmetry, but it's a weird radial symmetry, which is usually 5 rate. They also can regenerate limbs. Now, the same fishermen who were worried about sponges hurting their oyster beds also were worried about starfish or sea stars hurting their oyster beds, so they chopped those up. And turns out if you chop these up, they will reproduce. And these are urchins. Not all urchins have painful venom in them, and some of them are actually quite delicious. These are sand dollars, too. Chordates are things that have a spinal cord. This would include humans. So humans, we would be in the phyla Chordata. And this includes fish, humans, dogs, birds, reptiles. This thing right here is the basilisk. In Central America, its name translates to the Jesus lizard because it runs on water. This was one of the animals I always wanted to see besides the blue morpho butterfly. When I finally saw one, I always thought they'd be like several feet long and the size of an iguana. They're cute little things, but they're only like 2 inches long and they move so fast. All you see are the ripples when they run across the water. Now we're just going to move into classes within chordates or chordata. So this is just the next group down. You're doing so well. Agnatha are the first fish that we have called jawless fish. And there's a really lame sci-fi channel movie called Lamprey. So this would be a lamprey, jawless fish. This one is actually a parasite, which will attach to other fish and chew its a little hole and then start drinking the blood. It's called a jawless fish because it just has a disc-shaped mouth. Now, some lamprey are invasive and problematic, but not all of them are. Chondriichthyes are cartilage skeleton fish. These are ones that the fish that swim with a sinusoidal motion. One thing is occasionally if you've watched things like the Meg, the Megalodon shark movie with Jason Statham, they show the shark swimming backwards. Sharks can't swim backwards. They can only swim forward and they have to keep swimming or they will suffocate. This includes sharks, skates, rays, sturgeons. These all serve really important roles in ecosystems. And so chondriichthyes. But these have to keep swimming so that water goes across their gills. And this one right here is a manta ray. It's one of my next goals is to swim with one of these things. Osteichthyes are the fastest fish. And the fastest fish are helped because they have bony skeletons. Most of these fish that are really fast will swim with just their tail fin called their caudal fin. Everything else gets pushed down. In the case of what we have right here, this sailfish, that sail is usually only raised when it is making a bait ball. Otherwise, when they're swimming fast, this whole thing is retracted down. And here's a flying fish. Yes, they do exist. And once they're airborne, they really have no aim. So when I worked on research boats, you would often get hit in the face or chest with one of these fish. And there's 2 species. One's about 8 inches long. That one hurts. The other one's only about an inch or 2 long. So there's a flying fish actually taking off too. Amphibians. These had gills at one point in their lives, lungs in a later stage. These seem to have evolved in freshwater, not in oceans. This includes things like frogs, toads, salamanders. Right here is a strawberry poison dart frog. Here is a axolotl. Here is another salamander. These things are kind of awesome. They have gills at one point in their lives, but they develop lungs later on. The lungs come from a really cool thing too. These fish, if you've ever had fish die in an aquarium, have a little bladder of air right along here called an air bladder. It helps them regulate buoyancy. When fish often get old or sick, they lose control of their air bladder, and that's when you see them literally float belly up in the aquarium because they've lost control of this. Over the course of evolution, that air bladder started developing more blood vessels, And by the time we get to amphibians, they start breathing using their air bladder. The air bladder, when we get to us, becomes our lungs. Reptiles are scaly skin, bones. Just so you know, they have a three-chambered heart. This includes snakes, turtles, lizards, tons of things. Uh, Amphibians don't do well in salt water. Reptiles were able to go back into salt water. Um, and they also can handle a drier climate because compared to amphibians, reptiles have a leathery eggshell that doesn't dry out, and they have a thicker skin that doesn't dry out. Now, from reptiles and dinosaurs, we get two amazing branches that come out, and they come out about 65 million years ago when an asteroid Chicxulub hit off the Yucatan Peninsula and wiped out a huge amount of diversity on the planet. Two groups that did really well were small and warm blooded, and they can move pretty quickly. One were birds. They have four-chambered hearts, feathers, and wings. So this is a hummingbird. Here's a motmot from Costa Rica. Here is the quetzal, which is a crazy-looking bird. It was one of the things I also wanted to see. Birds are the descendants of the dinosaurs that weren't wiped out, which is a weird thing to think about when you have chicken tenders. Mammals were the other group that did really well. They have a four-chambered heart, and they're warm-blooded. They have hair fur at one point in their lives, and the females produce milk. This includes tons of things, including us. We have koalas. We have a bush baby right here. This thing is, I love. It's Latin. It's from Madagascar. It's a type of lemur, and its Latin name is Indris indri. British explorers were trying to find this in the 1900s. When they came across it, some of the local tour guides who didn't speak English just pointed to it. Excuse me, that really is allergies. And said Indris indri, Indris indri. They were all proud, and so appropriating culture, they decided to give it that name. So its Latin name is Indris indri for genus and species. About 2 decades ago, another group of scientists who actually knew how to speak the languages of the locals on Madagascar proudly told the tribe that, hey, your tribe helped us find these. We've given it your name. And that's when they found out Indris indri means there it is over there. But so the thing that all mammals have in common is they have fur on their body at some point in their lives, and females produce milk, and they're warm blooded. So, and they are awesome. That is your crash course in taxonomy. It was a little bit long. For your third installment of class this week, I'm just going to give you some gardening videos and a very short quiz because I'm sorry things got up late or uploaded late. And I hope you're all doing well and enjoying the weather.